My two kids Sam and Robbie are twins. They're 6 years old. A year ago we were living at our old house, but something happened that led to us moving. It's a long awful story. I lived in my old house for 4 years. My wife Carol and I got married while I was living there, and we had our kids there too. The neighborhood was slowly changing, and not for the better, but even still we originally planned on staying in that house for the foreseeable future until this happened. We were a corner house, and
the house behind us on the intersecting road was covered by a bunch of tall trees and bushes, so we hardly ever saw those neighbors. Our neighbor on the right, however, his name was Steve. He had just moved there less than a year ago. At the time I had only ever spoken with him a couple of times. Both times I could hardly understand what he said because of his heavy accent, and he just overall didn't seem like the friendliest guy. Two of his windows overlooked our backyard. There wasn't much privacy, but whatever rooms the two windows were that overlooked the backyard, I had never seen the lights on in either of them, so I always assumed it was an unused guest room or something of that nature. One day in the summertime, Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard in their blow-up pool and with their water guns while I was outside doing yard work. There came a certain point where I was walking towards the detached garage, and then I saw Steve next door at his window for a second. On privacy, but whatever rooms the two windows were that overlooked the backyard, I had never seen the lights on in either of them, so I always assumed it was an unused guest room or something of that nature. One day in the summertime, Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard in their blow-up pool and with their water guns while I was outside doing yard work. There came a certain point where I was walking towards the detached garage, and then I saw Steve next door at his window for a second. On follow him into the backyard to ask him to show me what he was talking about. He pointed to one of Steve's upstairs windows that overlooked the backyard, and he said there was a white light that kept coming from that window. I right away assumed the worst and asked the twins if it looked like a camera flash. They both said yes. I told them it's time to dry off and come inside, so I helped them dry themselves and then brought them in. Where I went to tell Carol about this, she right away assumed the worst, just like me. She said I should go next door her and knock on Steve's door, so I did, but when I did he never answered the door. His car was even in the driveway, so he had to be home. After a few attempts at knocking and ringing the bell, I gave up and went back to my house. I told Carol he wasn't opening up, which made what the kids said seem even more credible. While we couldn't prove that the white light the kids were seeing was a camera flash, it sure did sound like it. And it was concerning to hear. Sometime passed, maybe even weeks, before one night when Carol and I were in the bedroom, we heard our side gate being quietly opened and closed outside. Carol wanted me to go check outside, so I stepped out into the backyard and looked around. I had on all the lights. As I searched, I found nothing and nobody, but I noticed the lights in Steve's backyard were on. I went over to look over the fence into his yard, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when he came up to the fence from the other side and asked if I needed something. I asked him if he'd seen or heard anyone sneaking through our yard. He said no. I took this time to also ask him bluntly if he had by chance been watching my kids, as they thought someone was at his window taking pictures of them playing in the pool. His reaction to this was a bit suspicious. He acted overly offended to my asking this, almost yelling at me for such an accusation. Again, without proof, I couldn't nor did I want to start issues with a neighbor. I apologized and went back inside. Carol was not happy about this, saying he's full of the next incident didn't happen until another few weeks later. This time it was in the middle of the night when we were asleep. I woke up to Carol shaking me in a panic. I looked around the room confused at first, but then when I heard the kids screaming from their room, I exploded from the bed and ran downstairs to the kids' room. Robbie was awake and crying, and I found out a few seconds later that his crying and screaming had awoken. Sammy was crying and screaming in reaction to him. Robbie said there was someone outside the window a second ago, and there was a camera flash from the window. I got goosebumps, but I also felt my blood begin to boil. All I could say was, "What did he look like?" He said he didn't see. I brought the kids up to our room to sleep in the bed with us with the lights off. I peeked out our bedroom window to look across at Steve's unlit house next door. I looked at each window of his house, and I found him. He just like me was peeking out one of the upstairs windows in that same room that overlooks the backyard. I stormed outside next door and rang his doorbell like 15 times. He never opened his door. I did call the police, just to make a report on Steve that way. If any future reports were made about him from other people, maybe the police department would look into him. I never saw him again. Sometimes I'd sit out front waiting to see him outside, but he'd clearly avoid coming outside when I'd be out there. Because of this, we ended up moving within a month to a new house in a different but nearby town, which has proven to be a better place to raise the kids. Anyway, about 3 months ago I moved into an apartment with 2 other women so I could attend college. There's a list of things that make the building we live in not that great. For example, most apartment rooms face the corridor where people from the same floor as you will constantly walk left and right to get in or out of the building. So if you keep your windows open, anyone pacing outside can see into your room. But considering I spend most of my time at college and the girls I live with and most of the neighbors are really nice, the things on that list don't really bother me that much. A few nights ago, while getting ready to go to bed, I could hear music playing from somewhere, mostly pop songs from the 2000s. Since we live in a student friendly city full of frat houses in the lakes, I thought nothing of it. There were probably a bunch of parties going on and the sound was coming from one of them, or maybe it was just some drunk friends listening to it on the street. I got into bed and let a random video play on my phone so I could fall asleep, as I often do. But as I was starting to doze off, I started to hear drilling noises. At first I thought I was just sleepy and hearing things, or maybe it was coming from my phone, but I paused the video and listened closely. There was definitely someone using a drill somewhere nearby. I got up and walked around the apartment feeling confused. It was around 11 p.m. so there was no way that someone could be working. Still, the sound was louder at my bedroom window, so I opened it to check and quickly realized that it was coming from the neighboring apartment, the one that's closest to my window. At that moment I realized that music was also coming from there. No one else lives in that specific apartment, so my confusion only grew. But then I figured maybe someone had planned to rent it, talked it over with the landlord, and he ordered for something in it to be fixed. Still, the fact that they were doing it so late into a Thursday felt really strange. I went back to trying to sleep, but they wouldn't stop making noise. I was texting a friend and eventually started complaining about it, sending him audios and even a video directed at the window that all the noise was coming from me. Said I should call the police because there was no way it was legal for someone to be doing this, especially in a building full of apartments. I decided against it since I just wanted to get some rest, and it was already past midnight by then. I forced myself to sleep through the drilling sounds, but a little past 1 o'clock in the morning I woke up again, this time to hammering, feeling stressed but not enough to take action just yet. I tried to sleep once more only to wake up again. This time I didn't even check what time it was. I was totally fed up, so I just put on a robe and made my way to confront whoever it was. The window to the apartment was open, so I decided to talk to those people from there. The window was located above the stairs, though, so I would have to go down a few steps to get into view, and I'd look even shorter being seen from there. But that was the last thing on my mind. As soon as I got to the window, I felt most of the courage leave me. In that room there were 4 men who all seemed to be around their 30s or 40s, and they all stopped whatever they were doing to look at me. Now only the song coming from the radio could be heard, and somehow it felt chilling to have all those other noises stop so abruptly, because even though that's everything I wanted just seconds earlier, I definitely didn't want to be the one thing. These 4 men were focused on another thing that bothered me, but I didn't think about until the next day, was those men's peculiar choice of music. It just felt creepy to realize that middle-aged men were listening to stuff that teenagers or even preteens would be listening to anyway. None of them looked shocked to see me. They just had puzzled what's that looks. Remembering why I was there in the first place, I said, "Excuse me, it's pretty late, and most people here have work early in the morning. If it's not too much to ask, can you guys do this some other time now? Mind you, I'm a pretty short and puny 19-year-old who didn't even think to put on something other than a robe. So when 2 of those 40-something-year-old men came to the window and towered over me, looking up and down at my body almost like predators, I froze up and felt the hairs in the back of my neck stand up. They were both sweaty and had their mouths agape, and one of them had a hammer that looked quite heavy in his hand. They started smiling in a sick, twisted way, and I felt a sudden urge to throw up. Extremely unsettled, I started slowly making my way back to my apartment, not taking my eyes off the men, feeling like they might try to grab me. When I got to the last step of the stairs and close enough to the window, as soon as I was out of their view, I dashed to my front door, got inside and locked it. One of the girls who lives with me was out of town that night, and I presumed the other one was asleep since she hadn't seen my text on our group chat asking them if anyone had moved into that apartment. I got back into my room and didn't hear any tools again. In reality, even the radio seemed to have been turned off. I wasn't really sure how to feel about that, because now I wasn't angry, just disgusted and creeped out. I know I should have called the cops by then, but I was just too stressed to deal with that any longer. Checking the time, it was about 2:15 now. I got into bed again, tricking myself into thinking I wasn't scared, just craving some sleep. Eventually I passed out. I woke up in the middle of the night again. This time it was around 3:30 and I could hear no sounds coming from the apartment. Everything was quiet, and that quickly started to bother me. It was too quiet. I had to have heard or felt something in order to wake up. The silence was making me uneasy, and I had a feeling that someone might have been on the other side of my closed window. I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't get a peaceful sleep after that. The next morning, as I was going out, I went past the same window and noticed that it was closed. It was as if this previous night had never even happened. But I asked the girl who was home with me if she heard anything. She said she had woken up several times during the night but couldn't get up and do something about it due to sleep paralysis. Either way, that confirmed I wasn't illusional. Those people really were there. But then how did they have the keys to the building in that apartment? Why did it seem like they didn't want to be seen during the day? What were they thinking of doing to me? Or maybe any passerby? It's been a week now, and thankfully I haven't seen those men again. Still, I have no idea who they were or what they were doing, and I'm honestly scared to even think about the possibility that they might come back or still be lurking around somewhere. I live in a pretty basic suburban town on Long Island, New York. My girlfriend Sarah and I recently start renting a small house perfect for Tutu, for we have a decent-sized backyard and our house is on a very quiet street. One side of our house has a water drainage basin, as the county calls it, which is just a bunch of trees surrounding a sump. On the other side is our neighbor Kyle, who lives with his wife. They're a bit older, in their 60s, and quiet. Then, directly across the street is a little patch of woods that's in front of another water drainage basin, so for people who like privacy out fronts, our house is perfect. But then there's the backyard. Kyle's house is blocked off by some bushes that the landlord planted years ago. So besides the house directly behind us over the fence, there's no other houses that could see into the yard. However, that one house looking into our backyard was all that it's taken to genuinely make Sarah and I uncomfortable. As I'm writing this, it's currently the fall, so we've been doing fall cleanup the past few weeks in the front and backyard. I started noticing, anytime we were out there, there were these two people standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was a middle-aged man and woman. When I'd look up to that window, they'd keep looking and watching me. It got really uncomfortable, to the point we pretend not to notice it, but we could only stomach doing this for so long. The leaves kept falling day by day and the fall cleaning would need to continue. Sarah wouldn't want to be in the yard anymore because she was getting so creeped out at those two people who would watch us out the window without fail. So one foggy day, while raking, I looked up at the window, and once again the two were standing at the big rectangular window. I decided to wave at them, see if they'd wave back. After a few seconds of smiling and waving, they didn't move. No reaction, but I could feel their stares and I could see their eyeballs looking at me. I turned away from the window and tried to continue raking, but after sneaking a peek back at the window a couple minutes later and seeing them still there, I felt too awkward and weird being out there. I went inside. Sarah said we should go over and introduce ourselves. At first I was hesitant of that, but I was persuaded to walk around the block with her to that house and ring the bell. We expected one of those people at the window to answer the door, but instead the door cracked open just enough to see half of a person's head. It didn't look like either of those people who were always at the window. It was also super dark in the house, to the point that it looked incredibly ominous and uncanny, staring at half of that person's face. This guy looked a lot younger, like in his 20s. Sarah and I tried to be friendly and introduce ourselves. The guy seemed very closed off though and not interested in speaking. He had a very what you need type of attitude about him, and when I asked if he lives with anyone else here, like his parents, he said no. I mentioned the man and woman who were always at the window upstairs, and the guy on the other side of the door said he doesn't know who I'm talking about. Sarah and I felt really unsettled, so we just left. But weirdly, as we walked down the walkway back to the sidewalk, I noticed the guy behind the door was still peering half of his face through the cracked open door. I'm sure he watched us walk away until we were out of sight. That interaction was weirder and creepier than we were expecting. When we got back home, I went upstairs to our room. The upstairs of our house is only our master bedroom and the bathroom. It has two windows. One of the windows looks over to that house over the fence, and I looked out the window to see those two people looking out the window again, and even at this distance I felt like they were staring right at me. I shut the blinds and went down to tell Sarah we agreed it was time to plant some arborvitaes to block their window from view. The only problem, one of the backyard windows, the blinds of it were of course shut because we didn't want those creepy people looking into our living room at night. I approached it, and yes, it was 100% a fist knocking on the glass. I considered saying who's there, but I froze and I was too scared. Instead I flicked on the backyard light, and then the knock effing stopped. I didn't even want to look out the window or door. I kept the light on and then went back upstairs to my room, where I told Sarah about the creepy knocking, but I claimed that I chased whoever it was away. I exaggerated in fear of sounding like a coward. I also didn't want her to worry. We both imagined it to have been something to do with that house, though. Nothing has happened since, but I'll have to update throughout the winter update. It's been 2 weeks and we haven't seen those people at the window ever since, but last night we heard yelling and screaming from that house. I had to open our window and it became clear there were muffled yells coming from that house. The fact that we heard it through two sets of closed windows just goes to show how loud the yelling was. Then out of nowhere it just stopped and went quiet. We almost called the police, but ultimately didn't. I'll update again if anything else happens, but we're really getting creeped out here now.